Hello everyone, and welcome to another Cut Rate Commander Precon Upgrade Guide, the series in which we give Precon decks a glow up without breaking the bank. My name's Grazzet, and today we'll be giving the Bloomburrow Peace Offering Precon $35 worth of upgrades to bring it up to Cut Rate standards. As usual though, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content. Consider supporting the channel directly either via my Buy Me a Coffee or my Game Nerds affiliate links in the description if you really like it. And be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see what Precon will be covering next. Also, if you'd like to see my blind reaction and thoughts to the base Precon before any upgrades, you can do so by checking out my first impressions of it also in the description. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. This deck's face commander is Miss Bumbleflower, a 1/5 rabbit citizen with vigilance that costs 1 and Bant that has the following ability. Whenever we cast a spell, target opponent draws a card and we put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. That creature gains flying until end of turn, and if this is the second time this ability has resolved this turn, we draw 2 cards. Breaking down her core stats, Miss Bumbleflower is sporting a mid-weight CMC, a very low power but slightly above average toughness stat block for her cost, built-in vigilance to allow her to still intercept attacks for us even after she swings in, and an ability that, while it can permanently grow her and our other creatures while providing them with temporary evasion, does so at the cost of giving our opponents additional resources. Now don't get me wrong, the ability to turn every single spell we cast into repeatable +1/+1 counter distribution and on-demand evasion is fantastic, synergizing very well with Bant's already impressive +1/+1 counter archetype to grow our creatures even faster, and enabling them to get in for damage reliably with their boosted stats, with the added benefits of not being limited to how many times we can proc it, letting us trigger it both on our and our opponent's turns, and turning the first 2 spells we cast into pseudo-cantrips so long as we cast at least 2 a turn so we can replenish our hands with it. The issue comes in the fact that we're required to let one of our opponents draw a card every single time we proc it, which of course is a pretty significant downside, as we generally don't want to be giving our opponents resources that they can in turn use against us, such as the removal or board wipes they'll need to deal with our counter-laden creatures, or the pieces that they need in order to take control of the game themselves. So the question then becomes, how do we get the maximum advantage out of Miss Bumbleflower while mitigating the amount of value our opponents generate as we use her? And after much deliberation, the answer I came up with was actually leaning more into the fact that we give our opponents resources, and in doing so, generate even more value for ourselves. You see, no matter how much we adjust this deck, our commander will always generate value for our opponents by us just playing the game, meaning trying to mitigate that value will be largely a fruitless effort. So instead, since we're going to be giving our opponents cards anyway, we'll be focusing on taking advantage of the influx of resources our opponents will be receiving, building upon the payoffs already included in the base deck that take advantage of our opponents casting their spells, by adding in even more ways to generate us value as our opponents receive and use those resources. Then, in order to ensure that our opponents will have more resources than they know what to do with so we can constantly proc said payoffs, we'll be adding in even more symmetrical card draw effects to keep force-feeding the table cards, allowing us to churn through our deck at a breakneck pace to both proc our existing and new draw payoffs, as well as letting us dig through our deck for our old and new alternate win conditions, positioning Miss Bumbleflower to either beat down our opponents with her constant stream of +1/+1 counters, or simply be used as another draw source to let us achieve victory through less traditional means. So let us make our way to the plain of Bloomburrow and into Three Tree City, where if we follow the smell of stew, we'll eventually find our way to Miss Bumbleflower's Inn, where the hearth is warm, the food is good, and the ever-attentive proprietor will do her best to make us feel welcome. That said, I would recommend against trying to take advantage of this rabbit folk's kindness, as her burly friends, the old crew members of her pirate mother, are always near to keep an eye on her well-being, something that Mr. Foxglove can attest to after his many failed attempts to court her. So just sit back, relax, and enjoy the stew and company, which should hopefully be a welcome respite from all the multi-universal threats we've encountered so far. So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and her playstyle, let's jump straight into the upgrades. So, the very first thing we'll be focusing our efforts on in this upgrade is increasing the number of ways we can give our opponents, and therefore ourselves, resources, of which the base build has a number of built-in ways to do so already, so we can more consistently generate value as our opponents use said resources. For example, in an effort to get more cards into all our opponents' hands, we'll be replacing the bit too slow land Thriving Grove, the much too gift-specific payoff Jolly Gerbils, and the unnecessary Fog Riot Control with Kami of the Crescent Moon, Howling Mine, and Dictative Prufix, all of which let us and our opponents draw an extra card on each of our draw phases, with the last one also being castable at flash speed if we want to proc our commander on our opponent's turn with it, and swapping out Fisher's Talent, which is a fine source of repeatable card advantage, but would find a much better home in a deck that can manipulate its top deck consistently to proc its token creation to make space for Struggle for Project Purity, which again provides our opponents with some resources, but gives us a lot more by letting each of them draw 1 while we draw 3 per rotation. Then, as some more player-specific sources of extra card advantage, we'll be cutting Broken Wings, which is a bit too underwhelming as a back row removal piece that occasionally hits flyers, to make space for Oblation, which provides instant speed non-destruction permanent removal to deal with a wider array of threats, while also giving the affected opponents more card advantage for us to benefit from, replacing Promise of Loyalty, which is admittedly a fine on-theme board wipe, with Fall of the First Civilization, which may be slow but fits a bit better here as initially another 2-player draw effect, and then later as a back row removal piece and a permanent destroying wipe to help pad our other core stats, and Shelving Tempt with Bunnies, whose floor as a cantrip that creates a 1/1 is too low in my opinion for a card that puts its potential power in our opponent's hands, so we can give it spot to Gulch the Bestower, whose defensive flying stat block can help keep us alive against attacks, and whose player-specific draw, counter distribution, and ramp are much easier to point to who we want to, with us generally taking the ramp so we can cast more of the spells we draw into, or set up potential wins through our alternate wincons. Now, having increased both our and our opponent's ability to generate card advantage, we'll be switching gears to augmenting the base build's ability to derive value from our opponents drawing and playing those cards, with even more payoffs for them doing so, in which we'll be raising the excess and too slow land Thriving Heath so we can slot in Fairy Mastermind, which turns every second card our opponents draw each turn into even more draw for ourselves, on top of being castable at flash speed and providing even more symmetrical draw itself if we have the mana, replacing Octomancer, which is interesting but lacks the necessary resources in this build to get the most usage out of its token copying effect, with Council of 4, which generates us even more card draw as any player draws their second card, as well as board presence when anyone casts their second spell, and while it may be limited to that player's turn, it can easily draw us 4 cards and create 8/8 worth of stats for us each rotation, on top of being a massive defensive body that can easily intercept all but the biggest attacks for us, and swapping out Coiling Oracle, which is an okay cantrip or source of ramp but is otherwise unremarkable in this build, to swap in Smuggler's Share, which provides yet another source of card draw as our opponents draw cards, this time proccing for each opponent on every turn, while occasionally generating us incidental ramp in the form of treasures if our opponents have access to land ramp. And as one final way to generate value off of our opponents, we'll be sidelining Illusionist's Gambit, whose attack redirection can be useful but is mostly unnecessary here considering the rate at which we can grow our creatures with counters to simply block attacks the old-fashioned way, so we can add in Wedding Ring in its place, which at base simply allows us to benefit from an opponent's draw and life gain on their turn and vice versa, again synergizing quite nicely with all our symmetrical draw effects, but also benefits from creating a forced alliance between us and the player in question, who now has a vested interest in keeping us alive if they want to keep benefiting from the huge boost in card advantage we're now providing them with. Then, having augmented our ability to generate truly massive amounts of card advantage, we'll be briefly turning our sights to the existing draw payoff suite our build has at its disposal by adding in one more entry to get just a bit more mileage from it, namely by letting go of Spore Frog, which, like all the other fogs in this deck, is ultimately unnecessary due to how big we can make our blockers, so we can give it spot to Prof Cydetic Memory, which turns all our draw into even more +1/+1 counter distribution to grow our creatures even faster, while having the added benefit of removing our maximum hand size limit, which provides a nice bit of redundancy alongside the core deck's other hand size increasing and removing options so we can consistently avoid having to discard down. And speaking of which, we'll also be pitching Martial Impetus, which is a somewhat ill-fitting and slow piece of soft removal in this deck, to make space for Decanter of Endless Water, which gives us yet another way to remove our maximum hand size limit to ensure all our draw doesn't go to waste, while also providing us with some solid ramp in the form of a 3-color mana rock for additional consistency. Now, with most of our draw-focused entries covered, the next few changes we'll be making to this build will be focused around empowering the build's existing alternate win condition package to ensure we can reliably achieve these while giving our opponents the smallest window of opportunity possible to react to them. Firstly, by adding in another alternate win condition by cutting the somewhat out-of-place board wipe Realm Cloaked Giant with the classic white alternate wincon Approach of the Second Sun, which between all our ramp and draw we can conceivably cast, draw into, and cast again all on the same turn to win the game out of nowhere, and secondly by replacing the somewhat situational wipe Perplexing Test and one of the build's scry lands Temple of Enlightenment with the flash speed granting sources Heliod of the Radiant Dawn and Alchemist's Refuge, both of which considerably shorten the amount of time our opponents can react to our wincons by virtue of letting us cast them on the end phase before the turn gets back to us, with the former initially serving as enchantment recursion when he ETBs, and that we can later transform to provide the flash speed casting as well as cost reduction to all our spells that scales with our opponent's draw for additional synergy, and the latter simply providing us with on-demand flash speed casting from the relative safety of our land base. Then, considering we're almost at the end of our upgrades, we may as well supplement the base build's +1/+1 counter-focused suite with another entry to benefit from our commander's counter distribution, specifically by removing Sphinx of Enlightenment, which is an okay group hug piece on a big evasive body, but is a bit too mana intensive and now redundant with all the symmetrical draw we've added to the build, and adding in Evolution Witness, which can easily return 2+ permanents back to our hand from our bin each turn in conjunction with our commander's counter distribution to either recur destroyed value pieces or to bring back 3 out of our 4 alternate win conditions for another go. And lastly, as some quality of life changes to help bolster the build's core stats, we'll be letting go of the unnecessary Pillow Fort piece, Bard Steward of Argive, to make space for Nadu Winged Wisdom, who has recently cratered in price, and synergizes very well with our commander's targeted counter distribution by providing us with a steady flow of card advantage and land-based ramp as she spreads said counters, terraforming our last remaining thriving land, Thriving Isle, into the plains and forest fetching Croson Verge, which helps fix for our colors in the early game and can hit both of the battle lands included in the base build for some added consistency, and lastly, cutting the bit too mana intensive draw payoff Hoofprints of the Stag, the too expensive and unwieldy mana rock / draw source Coveted Jewel, and the subpar draw source Secret Rendezvous, so we can add in the Spell Disruption suite Arcane Denial, Counterspell, and Negate, which help shore up the base build's below average number of removal pieces and give us cheap ways to intercept any incoming spells that would otherwise interfere with our game plan, which is particularly useful when we're going in for the win with our alternate win cons. So, now that we've covered all 22 cards which we've upgraded from the core build, let's take a look at the breakdown for this Precon upgrade. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 24 group hug pieces that can either give all or specific opponents additional resources, mainly in the form of card advantage, 8 ways for us to generate value off of our opponents as they draw excess cards or play multiple spells so we can benefit from all the extra resources we're giving them, 10 cards that care about us drawing cards or our hand size, and 8 ways to eliminate our maximum hand size to both generate us even more value as we draw cards and ensure that the cards we draw don't go to waste. 4 alternate win conditions and 2 sources of flash speed casting to give us multiple ways to close out games outside of combat, and greatly reducing the window our opponents have to react to them by letting us cast those spells on their turns. And finally, 13 sources of +1/+1 counters for themselves or others, and 3 cards that care about +1/+1 counters to further empower and generate value from the counter distribution our commander provides, thereby giving us the option to just turn our creature sideways to achieve a victory. For general deck stats, we have 20 ramp sources, 27 card draw sources, 10 targeted removal sources, and 1 board wipe. Our draw and ramp being off the charts in this build, which was intentional so that we can quickly go through our deck to find our payoffs or alternate win conditions, while also having access to the mana necessary to cast as many of those spells as possible to outpace our opponents. Looking at our mana curve, we have an average CMC of 3.03, leaving us with a relatively lightweight curve that wants us to get our commander on board quickly, then cast at least 2 spells each turn to proc or counter distribution and draw. Then from there, it's just a matter of us digging for more symmetrical draw sources and our payoffs that benefit from our opponents drawing and or casting the spells we give them, so we can start outpacing the value we provide our opponents, all while we build up our side of the board with +1/+1 counters and hold on to our alternate win conditions until the opportunity to play them presents itself, biding our time as our opponents use the resources we give them to attack each other until either our empowered creatures or our wincons snatch victory from right under their noses. The final price of this build then comes out to be $75.04 after upgrades. This price does not include tax or shipping and assumes that the price you paid for the Precon was $40. The price of the cards was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Now, if we want to add even more upgrades by going over budget, we can consider overhauling our ability to generate value off our opponents by replacing Peerless Recycling, Tamiyo Field Researcher, and Attempt with Discovery with Smothering Tithe to generate us a constant stream of treasures as we force our opponents to draw additional cards, Rhystic Studies to generate us even more card advantage as they cast their spells so they don't waste them, and a Trouble in Pairs to generate us even more card advantage if our opponents do just about anything, though do keep in mind that this trio of tax effects will be punishing our bank accounts even harder than they will our opponents if we decide to run them. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. So, with the Peace Offering Precon upgrade complete, the next upgrade we'll be tackling will be the Offspring Creating Family Matters Precon and its face commander, Zinnia Valley's Voice, so look forward to that build coming soon. In the meantime, however, it's time for all you folks to vote on which of the alternate commanders from the Precons you want to see get a build of their own. Those being either the card drawing and creature cheating Mr. Foxglove, the top deck sneak attacking Arthur Marigold Knight, the enchantment cascading Wild Seer Scouring Maw, or the squirrel empowering the Odd Acorn Gang. So be sure to cast your votes, link in the description, before the deadline on August 24th, and let me know in the comments which commander you voted for, and which commanders from this set you'd like to see in future polls. And again, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy this content to help keep this channel growing. Consider donating to my Buy Me a Coffee or using my Game Nerds affiliate link in the description if you want to support the channel directly. And if you want to see more videos like this one, either click on the videos floating around my head for the latest builds, or click on the card above for a playlist of all the videos I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.